The medical evaluation room at Naval Base Harbor was a storm of sterile steel and high-stakes tension. Several high-ranking officers stood in a semicircle, watching a critical diagnostic report with a cold, unyielding focus. Elena Carter, a quiet nurse in simple blue scrubs, stepped forward to assist with the monitors. As she adjusted her sleeve, a small, jagged, geometric tattoo on her wrist was revealed. A senior officer smirked. Then the Admiral saw it. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That doesn't belong here?" She didn't react. But minutes later, the Admiral realized he had just insulted a legend, and history was finally made. Elena Carter was 34 years old, and in the rigid, rank-driven world of the military medical wing, she was essentially a ghost. She was assigned to the Special Evaluation Unit at Naval Base Harbor, a place where titles were everything and your uniform told people exactly how much respect you deserved. Elena wore the simple Navy scrubs of a floor nurse, devoid of any stars, bars, or formal medals. To the elite surgeons and high-ranking officers who moved through the facility with an aura of untouchable authority, she was just support staff, a pair of hands meant to facilitate the brilliance of others, a background character in a theater of war. The environment at Naval Base Harbor was a cathedral of discipline. Everything followed a chain of command that was carved in granite and polished to a lethal shine. The air always smelled of high-grade gun oil, recycled oxygen, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold steel. The walls were lined with the portraits of legends, but Elena moved through the hallways like a ghost in the machine, her footsteps silent on the polished linoleum. She arrived 90 minutes early for every shift, not to chat in the break room, but to perform a system audit of the equipment herself. She noticed a micro leak in a portable oxygen tank, a detail that 99% of the staff would have missed, and quietly swapped it out without a word. She didn't seek credit. She only sought perfection in the mission of keeping souls anchored to the earth. To her, the facility wasn't a workplace. It was a biological landscape that required constant, silent calibration. That afternoon, a high-priority medical review was underway for a classified program involving Tier 1 operators. Admiral Vance, a man with hair the color of iron and a reputation for being the coldest, most precise tactician in the entire fleet, was presiding over the meeting. Vance was a man who lived and died by the book. To him, everything had a proper place, and anything that deviated from that established order was a sign of weakness or worse, a breach of discipline. He stood with his arms folded, his medals catching the glare of the fluorescent lights, a symbol of unyielding power in a room currently defined by human frailty. As Elena reached over to adjust the synchronization on the primary biometric screen, a high-definition monitor displaying the failing vitals of a test diver, the fabric of her sleeve pulled back just a few inches. On her left wrist, a small but strikingly sharp tattoo was exposed. A black, interlocking series of triangles, and a single stylized raven's wing. It was a mark that didn't belong in a sterile military environment, and certainly not on the skin of someone meant to be support. A junior commander standing behind the Admiral let out a soft, sharp breath, half a snort, half a laugh. The Admiral turned his head, his cold eyes tracking the source of the distraction until they landed on Elena's wrist. He paused, his iron-gray eyebrows furrowing in a mask of professional disapproval that could make a seasoned captain sweat. Then he let out a short, dry laugh that echoed in the sudden silence of the room, like a hammer on an anvil. "Is that a permanent marking, nurse?" Vance asked, his voice carrying a density that made the nearby heart monitors flicker. "I thought we maintained a certain level of aesthetic discipline in this wing. That decoration doesn't exactly scream professional medical standards. In my fleet, we don't allow distractions on the front lines. It doesn't belong in a room where decisions are made." The room went stone cold. The other nurses looked down at their shoes, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the Admiral's vocal authority. They saw Elena as a competent colleague, but no one was willing to risk their career to defend a nobody against a four-star Admiral. They assumed her silence was shame, or perhaps the realization that her youthful mistake had finally caught up with her in the most prestigious room on the base. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't blush, and she certainly didn't try to cover the tattoo or offer a panicked apology. She didn't explain that the ink on her skin was a map of a history the Admiral wasn't even cleared to discuss. She didn't mention the extraction in the red sector or the 3 months she spent in a bunker without a single sterile drape. She simply finished the adjustment on the screen with a hand that was as steady as a mountain, pulled her sleeve back down with a methodical, rhythmic motion, and retreated exactly 3 steps into the shadows of the corner. She stood perfectly still, her green eyes remaining locked on the data stream, her mind already calculating the next 3 variables of the diver's cardiac rhythm. She knew they were judging her by the surface. They assumed that because she had a marking on her skin, she was somehow less dedicated to the mission or less capable of understanding the gravity of the battlefield. In their world, professionalism was a costume you wore. In Elena's world, it was the competence you carried in your bones. She was the anchor they were too blind to see, waiting for the moment when the noise of their arrogance would finally fail, and the truth would be the only currency left on the table. If you think people are often judged too quickly by appearance, comment, "That is unfair." The medical review continued, but the atmosphere had shifted into something stagnant and heavy. The team was analyzing the biometric data of a specialized diving unit that had been subjected to extreme pressure changes in the North Sector. The readings were inconclusive. The cardiac rhythm was showing a ghost wave, a pattern that didn't match standard hypoxia, simple decompression sickness, or any of the algorithms programmed into the hospital's multi-million-dollar software. Dr. Sterling, the lead medical officer on the project, was barking orders for more analysis. He was young, brilliant on paper, and currently vibrating with the pressure of the Admiral's presence. "I've run the simulations 4 times, Sterling shouted, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "The numbers suggest a vascular leak, but the scans are clear. The heart is pushing, but the oxygen isn't landing. We're missing the transition point, and we're running out of time." Admiral Vance tapped his finger against the mahogany table, a rhythmic, impatient sound that mimicked the ticking of a countdown clock. "We don't have time for suggestions, Doctor. I need a conclusion before the next deployment cycle begins in 6 hours. If you can't find the fault in the data, I'll find a team that can. This mission is critical, and I won't have it stalled by a lack of insight in a room full of experts." Elena watched from the perimeter, her mind running through a high-speed simulation of her own. She didn't need the computer to tell her what was happening. She had seen this ghost wave before, in places where the air was thin and the stakes were higher than the clouds. She recognized the specific micro-lag in the T-wave transition that signaled a thoracic pressure imbalance common in high-altitude extraction. Not deep-sea diving. It was a refractory squeeze, a condition where the heart is working against an atmospheric vacuum rather than a physical obstruction. She looked at her wrist under the fabric of her navy sleeve. The tattoo there wasn't decoration. It was the insignia of the Shadow Raven Protocol, a Tier 1 tactical medical program that operated in the black zones where standard rules and standard equipment didn't apply. Every line in that tattoo represented a specific qualification: atmospheric navigation, high-stress stabilization, and advanced biosynchronization. It was a mark of a person who could find the rhythm of a life when the machines had already given up. She wanted to speak. She saw the fundamental mistake Sterling was making in the priority of his datasets. He was treating the lungs, but the problem was in the pressure gradient of the chest wall. But she remembered the Admiral's dismissive laugh. "That doesn't belong here." In the rigid military hierarchy, interrupting a lead officer after being publicly dismissed by a 4-star admiral is not just an error, it's professional suicide. If she spoke now, she wouldn't be heard. She would be escorted out for insubordination before the first syllable could land. So she waited. She watched as the experts threw hammers at a problem that required a needle. She saw the junior commander, who had laughed earlier, fumbling with the input codes, his ego shielding him from the terrifying reality that he was completely out of his depth. They were looking for a technical failure in the machines, but Elena knew the failure was in their perspective. They were looking at the numbers, but they were ignoring the anatomy of the environment. The medical fog of war had descended on the room. It's a psychological state where the brain, overwhelmed by too many conflicting signals, starts to ignore the critical data in favor of the loud data. Sterling was staring at the heart rate, but he was ignoring the skin temperature. He was shouting for more saline, but he was ignoring the rhythm of the mechanical ventilator. He was trying to dominate the data with volume, not realizing that trauma is a conversation, not a conquest. Elena realized that speed without awareness is just a faster way to fail. She saw the 3-millimeter lag in the rise of the primary monitor's heart rate. It wasn't a mechanical error. It was a biological reflection of the unpressurized ascent the divers had been forced into. She knew that if they pushed the next round of medication Sterling was prepping, the diver's heart would enter a refractory loop it wouldn't come back from. The window was closing, and the room was still shouting at the wind. She stood like a stone in the middle of a raging stream, her breathing deep, rhythmic, and even, mirroring the profound stillness of the desert at midnight. The men around her were still vibrating with the frequency of panic, but Elena was a fixed point, a lighthouse in the middle of a gale. She knew that truth doesn't need to shout to be correct. She was the code whisperer, waiting for the room to finally go silent so she could be heard. She reached out and quietly adjusted the oxygen flow on the secondary tank. Just a fraction, to buy the diver another 90 seconds. If you realize meaning is often hidden behind what we see, comment, "I was wrong." The heavy, reinforced double doors of the evaluation room swung open with a thud that seemed to push the air out of the room. General Eris Thorne, the chief of Special Operations Medicine and a living legend in the world of tactical trauma, marched in. He was a man with hair the color of iron and a reputation for being the only person who could tell an admiral to sit down and be heard. Thorne didn't look at the admiral. He didn't look at Sterling. He didn't look at the medals or the titles that usually demanded attention. He walked straight to the evaluation table, his presence pulling the chaos of the room into a sudden sharp focus. Thorne took in the scene in 3 seconds. The sweating doctor, the impatient admiral, the conclusive silence of a team that had hit a wall. And then his eyes shifted to the corner, moving through the noise until they found the stillness. He saw Elena Carter. The general stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't move toward the monitors. He took 2 deliberate steps toward Elena, ignoring the admiral entirely. He looked at her scrubs, then his gaze dropped to her wrist. Even through the fabric of her sleeve, he recognized the posture. Perfectly square, hands visible, eyes calm, the stance of a veteran. "Dr. Carter?" Thorne asked, his voice low, resonant, and carrying the weight of a professional directive that cut through the room like a laser through a bank of fog. The room went deathly silent. The admiral's jaw practically hit the floor, and his finger stopped its rhythmic tapping on the table. Sterling froze with his hand hovering over the keyboard. "Doctor?" Vance repeated, his voice cracking slightly with a mixture of shock and professional disbelief. "General, you must be mistaken. She's one of our civilian support nurses. I was just commenting on her lack of aesthetic standards." Thorne didn't even turn his head to look at the admiral. "Admiral Vance, if you were commenting on her tattoo, I hope it was to thank her for the 8 years she spent as the lead clinical coordinator for the Shadow Divisions. That decoration is the Raven Mark. It's the highest technical certification in the Department of Defense. It means she has stabilized more Tier 1 assets under fire than everyone in this room combined." Thorne looked back at Elena, his eyes full of a new, raw kind of respect that the admiral hadn't seen in decades. "Elena, I haven't seen you since the extraction in the Red Sector 10 years ago. I heard you chose a quiet assignment after the siege. I didn't realize that meant you'd be hiding in a naval base, mopping up after residents." Elena finally stepped out of the shadows. She pulled her sleeve up with a methodical grace, fully exposing the tattoo the admiral had mocked. "I like the quiet, General, but the data on that screen is getting loud, and it's telling a story that Dr. Sterling isn't listening to." The admiral froze. He realized that the woman he had dismissed as a background character was actually the world's leading expert on the very trauma he was witnessing. He had been looking at the uniform, but he had missed the master. He had been judging the book by its ink, forgetting that the ink was the table of contents for a legend. "What do you think about this case, Elena?" Thorne asked, stepping back to give her the floor. The first time she was asked directly, the room became a vacuum. 1. Identifying the fault point. Elena didn't waste time with a long explanation or a defense of her ego. She walked to the primary monitor and pointed to a tiny, almost invisible spike in the baseline rhythm. You're looking for a vascular leak because that's what the manual says happens in diving. But look at the T-wave lag. It's not a leak, it's an atmospheric thoracic lock. The divers weren't just in deep water. They were extracted via high-speed vertical ascent through an unpressurized cabin. Their blood isn't leaking, it's being squeezed by the pressure differential in the chest wall. 2. Correcting the direction. Dr. Sterling, stop the saline push immediately, Elena commanded. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it had a density that bypassed his insecurity and demanded compliance. If you push that fluid, you'll drown his heart. We need to run the shadow sequence. Adjust the data for 30,000 feet of rapid decompression and vent the secondary thoracic cavity. That's where your ghost wave is coming from. 3. Providing the logical path. The team, previously fractured and panicked, suddenly became a single synchronized unit under her guidance. She didn't affirm their mistakes, she simply redirected their rhythm. She spoke to the respiratory technician in a low, resonant tone that lowered the collective heart rate of everyone in the room. Within minutes, the computer began to sing a different song. The ghost wave was identified, analyzed, and a stabilization path was mapped out with surgical precision. She's right, Sterling whispered, staring at the results in absolute awe. The pressure lock explains every anomaly. It's perfect. Why didn't I see that? The Admiral stood in the back of the room, his rigid military spine softening for the first time in decades. He saw the way the general deferred to her, and he felt a cold spike of shame pierce through his military pride. He had laughed at a mark that represented a level of skill he would never achieve. Truth had arrived, and it was wearing blue scrubs and a raven tattoo. The invisible shadow was gone, and the master was standing in the center of the light. If you believe true expertise reveals itself when given a chance, comment, I am indebted. The remainder of the medical evaluation passed in a heavy, reflective silence that hung over the room like a protective shroud. The data was finalized, the divers were safe, and the mission parameters were adjusted to prevent another pressure lock. The tension in the bay had faded, replaced by a strange, quiet energy as the staff began to process the miracle they had just witnessed. The medical fog of war had lifted, leaving behind the wreckage of broken assumptions. Admiral Vance remained in the hallway after the meeting adjourned, leaning against the cold brick wall, watching the light crawl across the floor. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a man who had led thousands. Then at the door where Elena was finishing the final logs. He knew the story of the Raven in the Shadows would spread through the base by morning, but he also knew that he was the one who had almost lost the mission because of his own blindness. He felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on his chest like a physical stone. He walked back into the room as the others were leaving. He stopped a few feet away from Elena, struggling with the crushing weight of his own humility. He saw the woman, not the smock. He saw the legend, not the employee. Dr. Carter, Vance said, his voice hesitant and stripped of its usual booming authority. Elena stopped her work and turned with a slow, deliberate movement that mirrored the stillness she had maintained all afternoon. Yes, Admiral. I wanted to come over and apologize, Vance said, looking her in the eyes. I misjudged you. I was looking for a title on a chart and a clean sleeve on a uniform. I wasn't looking for the professional. I'm sorry I laughed. I'm sorry I was loud. I nearly grounded a mission because I was too blind to see the master standing in the corner. Elena looked at the iron gray man, her expression as neutral as a stone wall. It's okay, Admiral. Pressure creates tunnel vision. That's why we have a team. Even the parts of the team you don't think are military grade. The rhythm is the same everywhere. If you listen, the body tells the truth. You were just too busy listening to the rank. Vance winced at the cold truth of her words. He realized that her confidence wasn't a lack of interest in the room. It was a profound, terrifying competence that didn't need his validation. He felt like a trainee standing before a general whose battlefield was the human soul. General Thorne told me why you're here, Vance whispered, his voice full of a new kind of respect. He told me about the red sector, about how you stayed behind when the primary unit retreated. I didn't understand the shadow protocols then. I think I do now. I hope you do, Elena replied simply. Because next time, the divers might not have a raven in the corner to catch the fall, and the next mission might not have 60 seconds of grace. As the Admiral finally walked out of the evaluation room, the staff watched him go, then turned their eyes back to Elena. She was no longer invisible. She was the fixed point, the anchor, the ghost who had straightened the world when it started to tilt toward tragedy. She went back to her role, quietly finishing the paperwork as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the atmosphere at Naval Base Harbor was forever altered. They had seen the steel beneath the scrubs, and they would never look at a support nurse the same way again. If you believe understanding changes respect, comment, "I will live kindly." The story of Elena Carter is a vital, enduring reminder that true greatness is often found in the people we choose not to notice. We live in a world that is currently obsessed with stars, the ones who take up the most space, the ones who shout the loudest into microphones, and the ones who crave the bright spotlight for their own ego and validation. We judge people by the markings on their skin, the wrinkles in their clothes, or the lack of a prestigious title on their door. We forget that true identity is never found on the surface. True mastery is a silent thing. It's a fire that burns in the bones, forged in the heat of impossible experience and the discipline of relentless observation. It is a service, not a status symbol. Elena understood that her value was not in the recognition she received from the Admiral, but in the stabilized heart rate of the man she had just saved. She didn't need a medal to know she was elite. She only needed to know the mission was complete. Expertise isn't a title you put on a business card or a LinkedIn profile. It's a level of awareness that allows you to see the shadow pattern in the middle of a storm. It's the rare ability to keep your pulse steady and your mind clear when everyone else's is racing at 100 beats per minute. Elena didn't win an argument with the Admiral. She simply waited for the moment when the truth became the only thing left on the table. She proved that leadership is not about having the podium. It's about having the answer when no one else does. A single detail, like a small tattoo, can contain a lifetime of stories, sacrifices, and skills that are invisible to those who are too busy looking for a reason to judge. We often overlook the quiet professionals in our own lives, the colleagues who stay in the shadows, the mentors who listen far more than they speak, and the quiet observers who see the truth before it hits the headlines. We judge them by their uniforms, forgetting that they are carrying the weight of the reality we are too busy to notice. The next time you find yourself in a room where the experts are failing and the noise is deafening, look for the person in the corner who has been watching the baseline. Look for the quiet observer who has seen the patterns that others deem too small to notice. They might just be the raven you need to get home alive. They might just be the only reason the whole world keeps spinning while you're asleep in your bed. Real strength is quiet. Real leadership is clear. And real heroes don't care if you ever know their names. They only care that the mission is complete and the people are safe in their beds. Be the observer. Be the master of the detail. Be the truth. Let your actions be the only announcement you ever need to make. Because in the end, it's not what people say about you that defines your legacy. It's what the world becomes because you were there. Even if you stayed in the shadows until you were called to reveal who you were. That is the power of the silent professional. And that is the lasting lesson of the Admiral's nurse. History written in silence and saved in a heartbeat. If you believe the people who are judged too quickly, but prove their worth when it matters, deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that true identity is never on the surface, don't forget to subscribe for more.